thanks so much. Thanks so much for having us. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you to our discussant who agreed to discuss our paper. So the title of the paper is Can ChatGPT Help Investors Process Financial Information? And this paper is joint work with Alex, who's also here today, and Valerie Nikolai from Chicago as well. So basically, the key motivation of this paper is we are witnessing currently a revolution in AI, and in particular in these generative large language models, such as ChatGPT. If you, for example, go back to last year, November, when ChatGPT came out, if you use it yourself or if you read newspaper articles about it, I think it's fair to say that probably over the next few years, there will be a fundamental change in a lot of different professions. For example, outside of the financial realm, if you look at the Hollywood strike, for example, the writer's strike of, for example, also largely around to what extent AI could replace or supplement like the writing work in these professions. It's also probably true for the financial realm that these generative large language models will have a large impact, given that, for example, there's a lot of fintechs who are interested in this technology. There are hedge funds adopting this technology. So essentially, we are wondering in this paper to what extent it can be useful for investors to process this financial information. And then more broadly, also, what does this mean for firms who are preparing these textual disclosures, as well as regulators in terms of adjusting to it. So yeah, one key part therefore of the paper is understanding the economic usefulness of these tools for processing financial statements. Of course, I think also this use of generative AI or generative large language models is particularly suited for like financial economists or accountants for that matter, because companies do generate more and more unstructured corporate disclosures. There's a lot of papers, both in academia as well as if you look at the white papers by the SEC, essentially firms are disclosing more and more information, more and more textual information over time. And there's also this growing evidence, especially in the academic literature, that it also gets harder, especially for less sophisticated investors, to process this information efficiently. And perhaps tools such as generative AI, which can produce essentially, for example, shorter summaries of these textual disclosures, could help these investors to process this information. So essentially in this paper, we want to focus on these four research questions here. The first research question is essentially the main research question of the paper, which is about, is ChatGPT or GPT 3.5, which we are using in this paper, is it useful in extracting the most useful information from these type of disclosures? And the three sub-questions that we're trying to address are essentially, are these summaries? So summarization is one key component, or how this model also was evaluated. Is the summarized version of the longer corporate disclosure, is it useful in explaining, for example, stock market reactions and so on? Then we use this insight, basically finding, yes, these summaries are quite useful in terms of explaining contemporaneous stock market reactions. Is on the other side of the coin, essentially, could you learn something about the content that gets removed in these summaries? So do firms, for example, release excessive details in order, for example, to hide bad performance and so on? And could you use this insight to infer something about the so-called disclosure bloat, which these prior literatures suggest is there? And this is a little bit different from all these linguistic measures of bloat or fork index, for example, which mostly focus on how hard it is to read a sentence, and it's less about the content. So these transformer architectures, which are behind the ChatGPT, essentially allow us to infer which type of content is the most relevant. And then the last one is also about to what extent it's useful to get standardized targeted summaries. And here in this paper, we're currently focusing on mostly on like ESG information, financial information, but also some type of risk information. Okay, just quickly a few slides on ChatGPT itself. So ChatGPT is an artificial neural network which is trained with a trillion, so the exact number is unknown, but probably a trillion of parameters. And the key part why it's so distinct from prior large language models or even transformer models such as BERT is simply that it was trained on such a large corpus of text. So essentially used probably a lot of the internet, the data in the internet in order to train this model. So each word is modeled as this vector. So the embedding of word which essentially contains information on the context of each word. So if you have a sentence, then the sentence would be essentially a matrix. Then, similar to other transformer models, so GPT is a transformer model as well. It essentially rests on this self-attention mechanism, which tries to infer the relative importance in the input text. So basically tries to find out what is the most important part within an input that you give them, and then essentially you calculate the relations with this self-attention score here, the relevance of each word relative to each other. It then passes this text on and essentially produces new text by giving the most likely next word conditional on all prior words, as well as the overall language corpus. So this is essentially also, if you use ChatGPT yourself, it basically generates this text auto-regressively. So it starts with the first word, then the second word, and so on. And you see it directly writing down the text. So if you now query it, for example, with this input text here, which is compared to our competitors, our company is dedicated to promoting sustainable technologies such as renewable energies and net zero plan, and ask it to summarize this text. It depends a little bit on the parameters chosen. It will give you something like, our company promotes sustainable technologies because, for example, it identifies the pronoun as the pronoun of the main subject in the word, and then basically produces a shortened version of this text. Of course, this example also nicely illustrates the downside of summaries. There's obviously more detail included here. It, for example, talks about competitors. It talks about what the type of initiatives are. So it's an interesting question to see whether these summaries are still useful, or whether basically these summaries omit too many details in order to explain, for example, stock market reactions and so on. We also use this insight, especially the self-attention score, because it actually has a direct relation to the problem of information overload or information processing costs that individuals are facing. So if you think, we have a very small model in the paper, if you think that, for example, it's costly to process messages within a long text, then this self-attention or this attention mechanism of GPT would allow you to focus on the most relevant parts of each text, and therefore you don't have to consume the entire document, like lengthy disclosures, MD&As, or corporate conference calls and so on. So we have this model here with an investor who basically gets utility from consuming these financial statements, and the messages have different value to it. If it instead could only focus, on the most relevant messages, then of course it would incur lower costs. And we simply show this in this also inverse U-shaped type of model that essentially, in terms of consumption, it might be better to just consume a summary of the entire version, because reading the entire document, processing the entire document might be too costly. Of course, this will depend on the sophistication of the investor. So the more sophisticated, the higher the capacity of the investor, probably there's less gains from this type of technology. Okay, what do we do specifically? So what we do is we rely on GPT 3.5, which underpinned the initial version of ChatGPT. So since I think now, since a few months, also GPT 4.0 is available, we still rely on 3.5 here. And we use the API, the GPT 3.5 Turbo API, and we process a large set of financial disclosures. So we process MD&As and conference calls via this API. And one key problem here is that there's a token limit. So at the time when we ran these through the machine, it was essentially 4,000 tokens. Typically conference calls and MD&A sections are longer, so it requires some form of chunking algorithm. So similar to other applications outside of the financial accounting applications, you typically chunk the text into different pieces and then concatenate again them together. And so we run these chunks through it. We use so-called zero-shot summarizations. So we don't provide any additional information other than summarize this text without referring to any external outside sources, and then obtain the summary of this document. Due to time and processing constraints, we essentially drew a random sample of about 20% of all firms. And we generally find also that the covariance, they are balanced, so it seems to be representative of the entire sample of firms. And then, since we are mostly focusing on MD&As and conference calls from 2009 to 2020, we which had to do with the fact that we already had the tokenized version of these documents. We also confirmed that the results are similar if we use a sample period outside of the training window of the generative AI. So the first question is essentially, how effective are these summaries? And there we do mostly two things. The first thing is we simply look at the linguistic characteristics of both the summary as well as the original document. And the first key finding is, yeah, the summaries are much shorter compared to the original document. So here you could see from about 18,000 words in a typical MD&A, which is the management discussion section in any report, it goes down to about 4,000 words, which is like a reduction of 70 to 80%. Interestingly, at least interestingly to us, is the complexity, the linguistic complexity of the text, if anything, goes a little bit up, so it gets a little bit harder to digest, probably given that it now has to include more financial jargon, like a shorter text. And sentiment only changes a little bit. But the most striking result we found here is that the sentiment distribution widens, essentially. So it becomes essentially more descriptive of the underlying sentiment potential. So if we here split, and this is the first thing that we're doing, if we split the documents based on the raw sentiment of the document, so above sentiment and below median sentiment, we find that documents that were more positive before became even more positive in the summary, and more negative documents became more negative afterwards. So that's what we mean with the widening of the distribution or the amplification effect of the summarization process itself. Now to test whether these summaries are indeed still retain information content, we mostly rely on sentiment as a summary measure of the information content and correlate it with contemporaneous, like short window, 2-day abnormal stock returns of the. So what we're doing essentially, the abnormal returns is an outcome variable. Then we calculate the sentiment of the raw document and the sentiment of the summary document, and then essentially run a horse race between the two. In order to calculate sentiment, we on purpose use a relatively simplistic way to do this, the Looker-McDonald dictionary, with the key idea being that we essentially want to mimic like a simple or a retail investor who goes through a document and mostly focuses on positive and negative words and so on. We also include like standard controls, for example, the earnings surprise on the given day, and have different type of fixed effects. So the first finding is essentially here that if you look at raw documents, the sentiment of the raw documents, which is consistent with prior literature, we have here that the raw sentiment is not predictive or is not associated with contemporaneous stock returns. For example, if you look at column 1, with industry fixed effects or with firm fixed effects here, there's no significant association with the contemporaneous stock returns. However, once you use the sentiment of the summarized document, it's basically significant throughout and also economically meaningful. So for example, the R squares here more than double, and this also holds, for example, within firms, so when we include firm fixed effects. On the other hand, thanks for conference calls. For conference calls, also consistent with prior literature, we also find that sentiment is already correlated with contemporary stock returns, probably because during conference calls, there's a lot more information transmitted. For example, the earnings are announced, or the context of the earnings are announced. We still see this quite significant increase in the explanatory power. So here it goes from about 7% R squared to about 14% afterwards. So taken together, we see this as evidence that these summaries essentially have the ability to distill the most important piece of information from the original document. They're still quite informative of the underlying, or even more informative of the underlying performance. Then we use this insight to ask the question, okay, now given that we think that these summaries are informative, what is the information that is then left out? And is it, for example, associated with purposely full hiding, for example, bad information? So this motivates our disclosure of load measure. So we essentially want to measure the extent of unnecessary or excessive details using essentially this insight from before, that we can just compare the original length to the summary length and then deduct how much of this was apparently too excessive or too much information. So first, we just provide some descriptive statistics. So the average float in MBNAs is a little bit higher compared to the average float of conference calls, which to us intuitively makes sense given that MBNAs have a lot of legal disclaimers that need to be included, like this firm could face these and these risks, and then it's just a laundry list of all possible risks. But still, also for conference calls, we find about 70% float on average. Then if you make this decomposition exercise here, you see that some of the float is indeed related to like time and industry factors, like 16% here, but most of the float stems from firm level variation. And then if you then zoom in, it's also partially related to firm fixed effects. So here for MDNAs, again, this number is a little bit higher, given that there's a lot of legal boilerplate that just is continuously in these documents relative to conference calls itself. We also see some variation over time, even though, for example, if you're in the highest float rate in a given year, it's pretty likely that you will end up there again. Then we try to explain, okay, what is causing this disclosure bloat, this excessive information provision. And we found some evidence here that is, so column 1 and 2, column 1 and 3 is without firm fixed effects, column 2 and 4 is with firm fixed effects. We generally find that the most, two things are essentially explaining disclosure bloat. One is some form of complexity. So the more complex the firm, maybe it's more difficult than to explain the performance, for example, of the firm. So flow tends to be higher. But more importantly, if the firm is performing worse. So if ROA is bad, if sentiment is bad, if the firm recorded a loss, then we generally find even within firm that this disclosure bloat goes up, which would be consistent with like obfuscation story. Then next, we want to see whether disclosure bloat is then associated with information asymmetry or worse, price efficiency, with the idea being if indeed only the most sophisticated investors could see through this, what does this imply then for the market efficiency overall? And here we find, so when we look at short-term information asymmetry, both, for example, directly after as well as in the short period afterwards, we see that even with firm fixed effects, that the probability of informed trading tends to be higher, normal spread tends to be higher, and the post-filing volatility tends to go up. Then, in the last part of the paper, so we then try to use this knowledge in order to see whether targeted summaries are helpful or not. So our first query, where we basically just asked to summarize the entire document, we now ask for theme-specific summaries like ESG-related summaries, financial performance summaries, risk summaries. Here, we first query, for example, here conference calls for ESG-related sentences. So we ask, okay, please summarize the most the information related to any ESG topic or environmental topic in the document. And here we report the percentage of documents that include some type of ESG information. And consistent with like some other work before, we see this increasing trend in ESG-related information. So there is this increasing trend, whereas here, some different scales slightly, the financial discussion is pretty much the same. Then we also correlated with short-term abnormal returns, and we find that, especially in the most recent years, ESG sentiment is positively correlated as well with performance. But throughout the entire sample here, we mostly find that financial sentiment is correlated with contemporaneous stock returns. We then also in the paper, it's not here in the presentation, we also look at risk, so the ability of GPT to extract like the important risk components, like political risk, climate risk, and so on. And we also report some statistics. So taken together, I think this paper shows that GPT 3.5 or ChatGPT is capable of extracting the most useful information from corporate disclosures. It also allows to create this easy and intuitive way to measure disclosure bloat based on like a content level and not just a linguistic complexity level. And therefore, it also speaks a little bit to this discussion that actually goes back to the 80s with the SEC, for example, having the idea of providing abbreviated financial statement or summary annual reports. So yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion and then people questions. Thanks.
you for having me. Let me start by saying that this is a great paper and I really enjoyed reading it. So first, let me give an overview of the paper. Okay, so basically this paper examines the usefulness of large language models such as ChatGPT in processing information contained in corporate disclosures. Okay, so the authors use machine-readable corporate disclosures of U.S. public firms from 2009 to 2020. And they consider two types of corporate disclosures, MD&A sections in annual reports and conference call transcripts. They use a random sample of 20% of the firms. So the paper uses GPT 3.5 API to summarize these disclosures, and they construct several measures for these summaries, including the sentiment score, the length and readability of these summaries, and they compare these measures from the summaries with those from the original document. Okay, and then they constructed this very interesting measure, the disclosure float. Basically, this captures the extent to which the disclosures include irrelevant and redundant information. Lastly, they also use ChatGPT to generate targeted summaries on specific topics. So the findings are, first, the summaries generated by ChatGPT are dramatically shorter, and the sentiment is amplified, meaning that positive sentiment becomes more positive and the negative ones become more negative. The second main finding is that sentiment scores extracted from the summaries have stronger predictive power for stock market reactions to these corporate disclosures. Okay, it seems that these summaries contain useful information. Next, this is kind of one of the main the key result in the paper. Bloated disclosure is associated with negative capital market consequences in the form of a higher PIN, higher bid-ask spread, and higher post-filing stock return volatility. Okay, so basically, the interpretation here is that the companies try to obfuscate, and the disclosures as a result are associated with negative capital market outcomes. Lastly, the paper shows that targeted summaries that identify ESG and financial performance and risks contain useful information about the stock returns and stock return volatility. So overall, the authors interpret the evidence as suggesting that ChatGPT provides a useful tool for investors' information processing. So I think most of us will agree that ChatGPT is a very useful, productive tool. So it can help us, draft emails, revise our papers, and write code. But is it really useful for financial market participants in terms of processing corporate disclosure? To set the stage, let me share with you two anecdotes where ChatGPT helps investors make investment decisions. So in this Wall Street Journal article, it said that ChatGPT told a legendary investor, Masayoshi Son, that his ideas are great. Okay, and the article went on to say that Masayoshi Son rekindled his appetite for investment in technology by chatting with ChatGPT. Okay, but at this point you may think, wait, ChatGPT obviously has an incentive to tell everyone to invest in this generative AI technology because it's in their interest, right? So it helps improve the technology. So now the question is whether there is a general use of ChatGPT by investors in general. Okay, so in this Bloomberg article, it discusses how hedge fund managers are using ChatGPT. Particularly, it mentioned that managers are using the tool to summarize documents. Okay, and this is precisely what the paper focuses on. Okay, and this lends some credibility to the results reported in the paper. So what I like about the paper is that first, it addresses an important question on the usefulness of large language models in analyzing data in the context of corporate disclosures. And the results have important implications for investors as well as for corporate financial reporting. And also, the paper proposes a novel measure of disclosure bloat and explores its impact. And of course, the paper also presents a rich set of results on the use of ChatGPT in analyzing financial data. So now let me turn to my comments. My first comment concerns the bloat measure. Okay, so basically the authors introduce bloat as a measure of the degree of redundant or irrelevant information in corporate disclosures. And this measure is calculated as the scaled difference between the length of the raw document and the length of the summary provided by ChatGPT. Okay, so the measure has a mean of about 75% for MD&A sections and about 68% for conference call transcripts. So basically, it seems that a large majority of the contents were omitted in the summary. Okay, so now this raises the question about the nature of the information that is discarded in the summary generated by ChatGPT. Okay, naturally you wonder whether it's mostly redundant or irrelevant information. So I thought, who else would have the answer to these questions better than ChatGPT? Okay, so I, posed a long question. Okay, specifically I asked, what ChatGPT summarizes the MD&A section of a firm's 10K filing or earnings call transcripts using only the information included in the text with the following parameters. Okay, so these are the parameters that the authors use. What types of information are discarded in the summarized version? The why. List them in descending order in terms of the amount of information omitted. So here's the answer. Okay, so basically, there is a long list of different types of information. Okay, so from specific financial figures, historical context, technical jargons, legal and regulatory details, management's subjective opinion, forward-looking statements, etc. Okay, so basically, it seems that most of the information here seems to be relevant for investors to understand the full context of the disclosure. One exception is repetition and redundancy, but it's low on the list. So it seems that this is not a significant part of the information that is being omitted in the summary. Okay, so based on this, I think one can argue that high bloat firms may be fundamentally different in the sense that they may have more quantitative, contextual, or technical information, or they may have more concern. They are more concerned about litigation or regulation, or maybe they have more subjective and less verifiable information. Okay, so in such cases, they are likely to have higher information asymmetry, and this would explain the result that high bloat firms tend to have these negative capital market consequences. Okay, but in this case, it's not that high bloat causes negative capital market outcomes, but rather both the bloat and the capital market consequences are driven by the same underlying factor. So the authors include the first fixed effects. It helps, but it doesn't fully address the concern because these characteristics could be temporary within the same company. So my suggestion is to take a closer look into the information discarded in the process, and a cleaner identification of irrelevant and redundant information in the process would be helpful in improving the ability of the measure to capture managerial strategic considerations. My second comment concerns the possibility that ChatGPT may be too human-like. Okay, so basically, remember ChatGPT is trained on public data, such as Reddit, stock tweets, and Yahoo Finance. And it's possible that it may resemble investors who tend to overreact to public information. And if such investors move prices, then the summary sentiment would appear to better explain stock market reactions. And in this case, the summary sentiment doesn't contain new information, but rather it's just correlated with attention-driven trading behavior. This could be a concern, particularly because the authors focus on short-term stock market reactions on days 0 and 1, which might be influenced by attention-driven trading behavior. So I suggest that the authors test whether the return associated with these sentiment scores reverses subsequently. Okay, so if it's truly information, then we should expect no reversal afterwards. My last comment concerns the limits of large language models in processing corporate disclosures. Okay, so the models are as good as the data that they are trained on. Okay, so in particular, because training data are sourced from publicly available documents, they are likely tilted towards a larger, more established firms, because these firms have more corporate disclosures, media coverage, and they are more likely to show up in the public domain. As a result, ChatGPT might be particularly better at summarizing the disclosures of larger and more established firms, and it may not effectively capture unique characteristics and issues faced by smaller and less established firms. So I suggest that the authors look at cross-sectional heterogeneity, to see whether summaries for larger and more established firms are more informative than those for smaller and less established firms. And also, the author could consider expanding the sample to include the firms without analyst coverage. Okay, and this is to see whether there is a limit in the ability of large language models in processing information. So let me wrap up. So I think this is an excellent paper on an important and timely topic. And I have a few comments, and I hope they're helpful for the authors to revise the topic. Thank you very much.